been my first time I went round Highgate Cemetery was in 1966, and it's always had a special place in my heart. And tonight we're very fortunate in actually getting the former director of the Victorian Society here, and who better to be chief executive of the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust. It's faced many challenges over the year, and he's going to talk about the way in which they're looking at how they can handle new challenges for this century. So, Ian, can I pass over to you?
Thanks very much, Malcolm. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This is quite an exciting time for Highgate Cemetery. I must say, Highgate Cemetery has faced a few challenges over the years, but what a success it has been. It is absolutely amazing what the Friends have achieved over the period that they have been looking after this place. You know, back from having, no resources at all back in the 1970s to being able to look at a significant investment to make sure that Highgate Cemetery can face the future in a good, sustainable way. And I think that is a real testament to all the volunteers who've been involved with the cemetery over that period of time. But it's always been a highly contested place. And back in the 1880s, there was a grave owner here who bought an area of land next to the grave that she owned at Highgate Cemetery because she liked the elm tree which was growing on it. But unfortunately, by 1949, the tree had died, and the cemetery company then asked her descendants to remove it. And for some reason, they didn't. They probably thought it wasn't their responsibility. And the following year, it fell over and caused a lot of damage to some neighboring monuments. And the cemetery company responded by taking them to court. And unfortunately, that turned out not to have been a good idea because they lost. Why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because you're the Camden History Society, and I feel obliged to give you a little historical nugget to start with. But it also shows that the owners of Highgate Cemetery, the London Cemetery Company, had a statutory obligation to maintain the trees in the cemetery and to prevent them from doing damage. So we can't just leave the trees to fall over by themselves. And it would be even worse if one was to fall over and squash a person or a grave owner or a visitor rather than just some monuments. So tonight, I've been asked to tell you a little bit about the Highgate Cemetery Landscape Master Plan competition entries. So that's not about the history of the Highgate Cemetery landscape itself, although that could be the subject of another talk. It's about the competition that Highgate Cemetery is running to help us choose the firm which is going to draw up a landscape master plan for Highgate Cemetery, which will set out the work program for the next 25 years and profoundly shape the appearance of the cemetery probably for the next 100 years, we hope. So this in itself is a historic event. We see on the screen, we've given the competition the subtitle, the same subtitle as the lecture, A Historic Cemetery for the 21st Century. Now, if you're like me, you probably cringe whenever you hear people using that phrase for the 21st century, especially now that we're 20 years into it. A fifth of the century has disappeared without us noticing. But the subtitle is there to emphasize that we're looking to the future rather than escaping into the past. The world is very different now from when the cemetery was conceived 180 years ago. And the cemetery is an evolving, changing, developing thing. You can't just put it into reverse. So to start with, I've got a little video which sets out some of the challenges that we face now. And during this talk, you'll be hearing not just from me, but from a number of other voices who are interested in the cemetery and the voices of the firms who have entered our landscape competition.
I think Highgate Cemetery is Britain's best known and best loved cemetery, and I've been enchanted by the place since I first came here in the 1980s. And what makes it special is this amazing landscape design where the paths snake up the hill and the monuments are softened by the trees and the ivy, and you hear the sound of birds.
And it just is an amazing place. I mean, 170,000 extraordinary people buried here, wonderful monuments. There's almost nowhere like it that I know, and we have to look after it.
I'm the sexton, or gravedigger if you would like. Been associated with the Highgate Cemetery for most of my life. My father and my uncle both worked here. Yeah, it's a special place. You don't get many cemeteries in London look like this, feel like this, are run like this.
The person that I loved most in all the world is here. That's my husband, who died 4.5 years ago. To have almost a nature reserve in the middle of busy North London, but also somewhere where so much emotion and love is vested, is pretty special, really.
My real passion for the cemetery is about the landscape, and in particular the living landscape in terms of the trees and the vegetation.
I live opposite it, and its trees, its green spaces, its graves are the backdrop to my life at home.
It has such a strong sense of history. It makes you feel really alive, but obviously reminds you of how fleeting our time is on this earth.
It's greatly overgrown. It needs a lot of attention. Some of its monuments are in difficulty. So we need a proper plan to sort out what we do, and that's what the landscape plan is about.
We've had a period of managed neglect where we've kept the cemetery ticking over, we've maintained that wonderful romantic atmosphere, but now we're looking to the future to see how best we can continue that for the future with the new challenges that we face.
Just walking around the cemetery, you can see that one of our main challenges is the trees. We have got a lot of self-set ash seedlings in particular. We're getting a lot of damage from the trees.
They're 90 foot tall, they're twisted, they're bent and they're sickly.
The facilities for the volunteers at the moment are pretty non-existent. We have sort of space for them to be able to make a cup of tea, but we don't have anywhere for them to relax or to necessarily sit down and catch up with each other, so it would be nice to have that space for them.
So we need new lockups for our machines. It will make our lives work-wise so much easier. If we're going to spend money on equipment, we need to keep it in the right place, and we don't have it at the moment.
Our vision for the cemetery is that it should remain a sanctuary for the people buried here, for those who come and visit them and the general visitors.
And preserving that link, the past to the present, onto the future, I think is a key part of what we have to do as the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust today.
To keep the enchantment, that's vital, but also to make sure that it's drained properly, that there are proper facilities for visitors and for grave owners.
I think one of the most important things is the fact that when you come here, you feel welcome. The staff are extremely kind. Preserving that is terribly important, that it mustn't become a business. It's always somewhere special to come to.
And now's a great opportunity to see how we can build networks with the local community. We can see how they can come and use and appreciate this special site with all their varying interests and backgrounds.
Wood That Works, it was set up as a community-based woodwork project for the local people from the community, and the long-term project was always to bring children from the local area, the local schools, into the cemetery, learn the history of the cemetery, and then return to the workshop and make something from some of the wood that they've found.
So that we can make it a place of education and a place of sharing and a place where people become familiar and protective together of foxes, squirrels, trees, just the natural world.
I'm currently sitting in a strangely quiet lockdown Highgate Library. We're next door neighbours, and we have in past decades worked together and supported each other. As part of its local history collection, which you can see behind me here, the library holds the public accessible reference archive, which comprises the cemetery's own material on its history.
We'll be choosing a greater variety of trees and planting them in the right places to restore the designed landscape quality that the founders of the cemetery had intended back in the 19th century.
If we plant our trees, then the trees are planted in locations where they can live their life to their full potential.
The cemetery is an important green space for this part of London. That's one of the things we want to make sure we improve, actually, is the biodiversity on the site.
Most of London is now being concreted and tarmacked over, so little places like this, they are oases for the creatures.
We're looking very much to the future. We're looking to do things gradually. The change needs to be considered, and it needs to work for many years to come.
It needs that balance between remaining a working cemetery where people continue to be buried and being a place of wildness and a place where nature flourishes and where we can make a contribution towards combating climate change and air pollution.
We want a manageable, sustainable landscape, but we don't want a manicured landscape.
It's very important that with the amount of emotion that's here, that people should have their individuality respected.
The children are really curious when they come to our workshop. They're always looking to the cemetery outside. That offers us opportunity to talk about nature, to talk about life and death.
This garden could become a wildlife haven, and also a place for people to actually feel good, to enjoy the countryside in the heart of London.
Take heed of the heritage of the site, that's why the reason it got its Grade 1 listing. But also take note of the last half century, what's happened there with the romantic decay, and marry those two together and give us a manageable landscape that has an appeal for generations to come.
What we're looking for is not a restoration of this place, so you won't come back in 10 years' time and find a sparkling new Highgate Cemetery. So we'll be keeping that atmosphere of decay, the rough round the edges feel, while making sure that it's sustainable for the future.
So that, in a nutshell, is our problem, and it's sort of an attempt to answer the question: why do you have to do anything? Why can't you just leave it alone? And the short answer is that actually, so let me move on to my next slide. There we go. Is that things happen anyway, and so what we're symbolizing here is a move from a passive management regime to an active management regime. It was a real shock. Back in 2008, 2009, I think it was, a report found that under the management of managed neglect, biodiversity has decreased at Highgate Cemetery, and that idea of returning the landscape to a mixed oak woodland actually didn't end up creating a more diverse environment. So management is something that we have to get on top of. You can't just leave it to natural forces, because this is what happens when it does. This slide on the left-hand side of the cemetery with St. Michael's in the background, that must be before 1880, because you can see St. Michael's still has those little pinnacles at the east end. And what you're looking at is this floriated cross right in the center of the picture back then, and the same cross as it is now. Completely submerged in the vegetation. The view of St. Michael's, which was so important in the history of the cemetery, completely lost, and a big ash tree there, hopefully nicely rooted, but certainly this amount of overgrowth is really suffocating that memorial landscape. So we then commissioned a conservation plan to help us with what we needed to do, because cemetery is a very contested space. Lots of people have different ideas about what should happen. And the three main strands of thinking that came out of that conservation plan were that trees, monuments, and buildings would be better looked after so that we can pass them on to the future rather than let them decay away. The cemetery will continue as an active burial ground, and that's because there's a great meaning and purpose from being an active burial ground that will also protect the cemetery from being designed for other purposes in the future. There's many examples of closed cemeteries which have been severely vandalized or in fact put to other uses. And also visiting will be easier and more rewarding. So this is our role as a charity to promote the public benefit of the cemetery. So that's in a nutshell is a conservation plan, but that's available to have a look at on our website if you're interested to consider the main points there. So a cemetery for the 21st century, what does that mean? Well, one thing it does mean is that we won't be returning Highgate Cemetery to its former glory, that cliched phrase that is always trotted out next to the word restoration, because cemeteries are about moving forward, growth and development. Here's a wonderful photograph from 1939 in May, taken 100 years to the day, I think, after the consecration of Highgate Cemetery. And if I just zoom in up the top here, you can now see a good view of the West Cemetery with St. Michael's Church up the top here on the hill, the terraced catacombs, the Beer Mausoleum, Swains Lane running down the side here to our chapel at the bottom, still, whoops, you might be able to make it, still with its cupola, still with these massive pinnacles, which was shorn off, I think, sometime perhaps in the 50s or 60s. And the characteristic of this landscape is a much more open parkland landscape with sinuous curvaceous paths. And just to orient you, in case you're not familiar with the cemetery, this is the area we call the circle, after the circle of tombs here with the cedar of Lebanon planted in the center. And this area was called the meadow, which in more recent times was meant to be open, I think, like a country churchyard. So there are a couple of reference points in the cemetery down to the courtyard here and the Swains Lane entrance. And then moving across to the East Cemetery, look at this. So when I say restored to its former glory, could you imagine if I seriously proposed this as a restoration of Highgate Cemetery?
Wow.
I would be strung up, because this sort of arid, barren landscape is really not what we would want nowadays. Environmentally, it's probably very poor. There's very limited habitats. And in fact, many of these trees have since gone. All of these poplars, for example, either fell down or were taken down by the Friends in the early days because they had a propensity to fall down. And if you remember the elm tree I was telling you about at the start of this talk, here is it here, a sort of landmark elm tree on that junction between the main path heading down the hill and the park, the path off to Marks. You can see it was a sizable tree and would have done quite a bit of damage when that came down. So restored to glory, I don't think so. I don't think that's what we're after. So what we've done is we've asked some 4 firms of landscape architects to come up with some more detailed plans. Stage 1 of the competition was really just to find out who was interested. Stage 2 is to ask them to draw up their ideas of what you might do with Highgate Cemetery in slightly more detail. And so you can have a look at this on the Highgate Cemetery website at highgatecemetery.org/competitions, or click the future button on the home page. So you see there's 4 submissions here from Colvin and Mogridge, Gustafson, Porter and Bowman, J&L Gibbons and Periscope. And it's just really, really exciting that we have such eminent practitioners of landscape architecture who are interested in working for our competition. And what we're doing as well is that we're asking you to, we call it share your thoughts, because this isn't a formal consultation. We'll be having one of those when the draft master plan is in place. But this is a time to get any preliminary thoughts out there about how appropriate the ideas might be for a cemetery, things that you think they should think about, things they've done that you don't like. And these responses are going to be fed into the judging panel, which meets next week, and then also to the successful team once they're appointed. So you have until, and this is why this is such a good time for this Camden History Society talk, you've got until Sunday evening to have a look at our website. You will see some of the videos and some of the visual material I'm going to show you. And you can fill in. You can see I've got a little picture of our chairman, Martin Aidney, who will be asking you some questions. But just in case you should think he's live there 24 hours a day, it's what's called a chat bot rather than Martin sitting at his computer at home, live answers to your questions. But we're really here for you. And the form to consultation fatigue as earlier in the proceedings. So the first, I thought it would be great if the competitors had a word about their entries, because they can explain probably a lot better than I can. So I have a video for each one. I will start off with Colvin and Mogridge.
For me, Highgate Cemetery is so special because of its dramatic topography and the skill with which Stephen Geary and David Ramsey laid out the paths to heighten anticipation and drama, until recently at least. When there were views out across London from this summit, the experience would have been spectacular, I think. While the East Cemetery is less dramatic, it still has a peaceful atmosphere, and interest is provided by the monuments to famous people buried there. So for us, the cemetery is at a tipping point right now on two fronts. Firstly, irreversible damage being caused to heritage features by vegetation, trees and ivy in particular. Secondly, the loss of predominant tree species, self-sown ash to ash dieback disease. The character of Highgate Cemetery will change over the next 2 decades, with or without our master plan. We hope to guide that change by establishing consensus around our vision and in managing the speed with which change happens. Our watchword will be evolution, not revolution. Our vision recognises the strengths of the respective characters of Highgate Cemetery. To the west, contemplative, picturesque woodland with dramatic topography, densely planted evergreen groups creating a sequence of strong contrast between light and shade along the journey uphill. An opportunity for greater biodiversity, wildlife interest, and enhanced ornamental planting. To the east, we are proposing a more pragmatic and structured landscape, a core woodland mosaic surrounded by more open areas of ornamental planting for greater all-year interest. As part of our design to improve sustainability, we're keen to explore the use of porous materials with high recycled content for paths within the cemetery, combined with attenuation where possible as part of our approach to improve both accessibility and upgrade the existing paths to create a more sustainable drainage system. Our proposals are for a more diverse habitat mosaic that strengthens resilience to future climate change and disease. And we will use a palette of low water demanding plant species. We are encouraging the exploration of recycling and reuse, including, if feasible, composting facilities within the cemetery or in partnership with a commercial composter. Monitoring and regular review of the woodland and trees management plan will be key to respond to changes and threats as they emerge. We're really excited by the prospect of improving the visitor experience, firstly by working closely with the appointed architectural team to integrate the much needed improved visitor facilities into this sensitive landscape. Better facilities for the gardening team, including less prominent composting, either by more discrete locations or building partnership with commercial composters off-site. We're also excited to improve the interpretation, both physically within the cemetery, as well as virtually, to help visitors access the stories, histories and points of interest, relating not just to heritage, but flora and fauna to enrich their visit too. Given the steeply sloping site, we will seek to improve physical accessibility using the principles of least restrictive access, in line with current guidance on accessibility. That means regular resting points in the form of benches and perches and possibly handrails to steeper sections. Opening vistas both within and beyond the cemeteries, in particular across the London skyline to St Paul's Cathedral, will add to the drama and enjoyment of the visit. Our proposals will improve accessibility within the cemetery and create a richer landscape with greater diversity and interest throughout the seasons of the year, a place of life. This will enhance the attractiveness of the cemetery for present and future grave owners, as well as create a richer, more uplifting experience for those visiting graves than the present condition of slow decay offers. Opportunities for new burials will be sought in both cemeteries in order to support the continued active burial practices to maintain its relevance, as well as income, which is so critical to the sustainable upkeep of the cemetery. We held term commissions with the Royal Parks Agency over a 15-year period, during which we helped deliver significant changes to the Grade 1 listed landscapes of the inner Royal Parks. The most significant of these was perhaps also the simplest: the removal of 3 trees to create a break in the avenue along Horse Guards Road. The break revealed the iconic view from Blue Bridge to the skyline of Horse Guards, so much enjoyed by visitors today. Most directly relevant to Highgate is our work at Sheffield General Cemetery, a lottery-funded project for Sheffield City Council. The General Cemetery shares a near parallel existence with Highgate Cemetery. Opened in 1836, expanded in the 1850s, and then a long, slow decline as the cemetery company first ran out of plots to sell, and then eventually money. Today, Sheffield General Cemetery is wrestling with the same challenges to those at Highgate. Our proposals are currently in for planning, with work due to start in September. So we feel we have done the dress rehearsal and hope we will have the opportunity to do the much needed improvements at Highgate.
And so this drawing you've seen, this is up near the circle where the Cedar of Lebanon once was. And perhaps not the most informative drawing, except these fastigiate evergreens, probably cypresses, such as you see in Italian cemeteries, would be a landmark visible from some distance. But they've also proposed a number of weeping trees in that area. So it's quite a theatrical sort of character. I'll just zoom in on the plans we've seen before. So up here with the circle, you can see there's a fair amount of clearing with those fastigiate trees dotted around the place. And there would also be groups of birch and a garden-esque display of choice flowering shrubs, with the potential view opened up from the terrace catacombs here all the way down here, stretching out over to London. That's quite a positive thing amongst most of the contributors, opening up these lost views. So in these long glades, you'd also get local views within the cemetery, and the trees dotted around would be the heritage trees which have been retained in that space. The edges would be planted with hazel, hornbeam, rowan, weeping birch, and you can see there's another one of these glades here where the meadow is. Also here where the houses are on Swains Lane, there are some fruit trees planted behind there already. The Friends had done some clearing, and so this design builds on that slightly cleared space. And then also back up here, they've called it Ashurst. This is an area of ground that actually still has some of the rectilinear feel of the formal planted garden, which was on this site in front of Ashurst House, which is where which is on the site of St. Michael's Church until 1830. It was demolished, but this retains some of its rectilinear feeling. You can see they've given some quite formal treatment here with these, I think there are the yew gateways in that area. So there's also a sculptural wall up here near the flat. I'm not quite sure what that is. And then you can also see down here, there's a pond, and you'll be perhaps alarmed to hear that there is a pond there already. There's a lot of water, as you know, flowing over Highgate, and that pond seems to have grown in size. So that's an interesting idea, because there's already a few underwater graves in the area, and this proposal would create a few more. Down along the border here, you can see there's higher density of planting with evergreen accent planting, accentuating the paths here, say on the main Colonnade Path and on the Colonnade, on the Cuttings Road here down at the southern end of the site. We've also seen already these landscape typology pictures, just to give you an idea what they look like. That came up in the video you've just seen, more rectilinear planting there on the Ashurst site, and these long glades forming, opening up views to central London there, and Mosaic Woodland. In the East Cemetery, this is a typical path. It looks a lot like it does at the present, you might think, but actually it represents a considerable thinning out of the trees. And looking at the larger drawing, you can see there's quite a degree of clearance around the edge of the site. This Swain's Ground, for example, has a much more open character with few trees, a lot of ornamental planting, species-rich grasslands, which would allow visual interactions along Swain's Lane. You can see along here there seems to be a sort of hedgerow which has only been there since that photograph I showed you from the 1930s.
Can I just give you take that and just take these two with it? Thanks, James. And listen to it.
I don't think that person speaking to me, are they?
No.
Okay, good.
Can I remind people if you can make sure you're muted? Thank you.
I thought people might have been upset there at the idea of screening from Swain's Lane, but actually that's quite a good idea, especially with all the traffic. And I know traffic on Swain's Lane has been also a source of great local controversy. The rest of it, the green shaded area, is going to be what's called Mosaic Woodland, improved for the longevity of trees and to improve the variety of habitats, with these cleared areas, or woodland rooms they've been called, which will allow more sun in. And I think they tend to be around some of the historic trees which have been haloed, is the expression, to let the sun in, to give them more of a chance of growing. There's a couple of interesting areas of improvement down the bottom here, near the great 1970s Camden estate, which is partly built on what was cemetery land down here. You can see that's been cleared, and a variety of shrubs and flowering plants introduced there to give the people on the estate something to look at as they walk on the elevated walkway. But interesting also a structure there, which is a columbarium, or a wall for the reception of ashes for burial in the cemetery. Whether interesting to see what the residents would think about that. And then also here on what's the area that's called the Mound, which is a recent area where the burial started, I think probably around 2005, recognizing that there's some need for environmental improvements there for existing grave owners to make that look a bit better. So that's Colvin and Moggridge. Next up is Gustafsson, Porter and Bowman.
Being allowed through the front gate of Highgate Cemetery is being allowed into a hidden world separate from the city. It really creates an awareness and sense of expectation. The combination of the graves representing many lost histories shrouded in nature creates a sort of soft melancholy that compels one to want to inquire and explore further. It's a heady, almost intoxicating mix that one doesn't experience in other places. It's very special and unique. Our vision is to create a topographical exploration and discovery of both cemeteries. The walk up the hill, starting in the East Cemetery, creates a topographical experience that starts with the original grid of paths that echo the grid of the surrounding city. We wish to emphasize it with new avenues of trees, framing views of graves and a mosaic of flowering perennials. As one rises up the hill, the topography gets steeper and one is introduced to the arabesque, picturesque layout of the West Cemetery, where we imagine the woodland opening and closing to reveal glades of sunlight, views into the woodland, revealing hidden graves and drifts of woodland plants. At the top of the hill, within the Circle of Lebanon and above the catacombs, the planting gets much more exotic in character, and it represents a paradise on earth, And here one gets fantastic views over central London and the cemetery that sits down below you. With ash dieback, they currently create a monoculture, which means that with their removal, we create a new opportunity. We can plant a much more diverse range of trees. And with the sunlight being enabled through the glades and the meadows, we can create a much more diverse understory of flowering plants. These in turn will allow wildlife to flourish and be more diverse. All of this is done with the idea that climate change is upon us, and we need to make choices that relate to the wetter winters, the drier summers, and the increase in temperatures. So we're also creating a much more resilient landscape. One of the opportunities that we see for the site is to be able to open on occasions the north and south gates. This will help link the communities that surround the cemetery. As one moves between the north and south entrances, one can accompany people with the inexhaustible wealth of stories that you find on the site. These can be changed and they can be revealed over time. And with patience and using local artists, storytellers, we can update the media to encourage repeat visits and engage people online. By opening up the woodlands with glades of sunlight and meadows, we can rediscover old paths, improve existing paths, and open up the cemetery and create attachments for those visiting and placing their loved ones within its context. By creating this more diverse range of landscapes, some sunny, some shaded, some in the meadow, some on the hillside, we can create sort of relationships between the people who are being buried there and the characters of space that they probably would love to be surrounded by. The project that most recalls the work we're now thinking about and looking at doing at Highgate Cemetery is an amazing project that we did in Lebanon. It was called the Garden of Forgiveness. It was an extraordinary site with layers of archaeology from the Phoenician period, Greek, medieval, layers of Beirut's past. And it was really about how to bring a community together, how through archaeology we could discover past histories, how by bringing people to the site we could get them to share and find ways to become a unified community. And also it was looking towards the future, how to create a future history together in what is obviously seen as a divided country. So it was an extraordinary project. It's not fully realized, only partially realized, but it has that sort of layering of extraordinary histories, stories, that really reminds me of the similar stories we're finding at Highgate, and ones that we really want to explore and develop as we move on with the project, if we're lucky enough to be chosen.
You can see there's some poetry. I think I like the way they write about their plans. There's one part where he says the replanting of the cemeteries will create a paradise for people, for grave inhabitants, grave visitors, and a treat for botanists and horticulturalists. Species-rich communities, parishes of plants within the city, a multiplicity of different miniature and relatively undisturbed habitats. And actually, the same description might fit a number of the other entries as well, which are actually a good sign that there's some consensus amongst the professionals as to the necessity to provide for these sorts of things. So their view, you've already seen into the West Cemetery, is it's a luscious illustration. I particularly like the idea that from here we are just at the Otway Mausoleum. Here is the meadow I showed you earlier, but look, you can see down towards the city. And here is our chapel rearing up with its pinnacles, with its cupola. As you could see, in a view from 1839, which was recorded in a watercolour at the London Metropolitan Archive. So that's wonderful to see that as a historic improvement. And of course, I'm obsessed with paths, and you can see here that we have gravel paths with a solid edging, which is probably going to deal with the difficulty of managing the edges in a cemetery. But it also makes me think gravel paths, walking on them, that nice crunchy noises, all the senses you get in the cemetery, bright colors of flowers, deep greens of foliage, the different textures of leaves, tweeting birds, an aeroplane flying over, the smell of wild garlic. You know, the cemetery is a really rich sensory location, and I get the feeling that that's what they're thinking about here. The drawing, I think, is reasonably clear to interpret as a good drawing style, but I'll just zoom in on these. There's a historic photograph, even from 1960. You could see the chapel rearing up above the Otway Mausoleum with its cupola there. You could see the Mears monument sticking up. So a lot of these views, which I was going to say relatively recently lost, but of course that is 60 years ago, and that's the equivalent view today with the intrusive vegetation. But moving on to the drawing, they have a very clear graphic style, I think, the Gustafsson Porter Bowman team, with this area up around the circle, with quite a significant degree of clearance there up around here. This is the area they referred to as a paradise on earth, mostly planted with natives all around the cemetery, but here there'd be some non-natives as well, including the camellia variety Robert Fortune, which was brought to Europe in 1820 and much loved by Charles Dickens. And that's one of the things about this scheme. They're interested in stories, plants with stories to tell. They're interested in the Victorian language of flowers. They're interested in the Victorian love of ferns, and they're interested in the way the Victorian plant collectors scoured the globe for plants to bring back to this country. So there's a few non-natives here, but they would be all with over 100 years of experience in this country. So we'd know how, hopefully, non-invasive they were. We'd know how they responded to the particularities of our climate. So we wouldn't be taking the risk of re-importing rhododendrons or Japanese knotweed or something like that. It's also these glades dotted around, allowing much more light into parts of the cemetery. The view clear here to allow views down to the centre of London, and then a secondary view here is where we were standing before, looking at the Otway Mausoleum, down to the chapel again, and with the Mears monument probably about there. So as you walked up the stairs of the colonnade, you would see that great Gothic monument there directly in front of you. This semi-open character of the meadow, some glades opened up with some cross views across the cemetery. But interesting, I think it looks as though the pond has perhaps disappeared, which some people might think is good. And then down here, a more thickly planted area, again providing some screening from the back of the flats, and giving some privacy actually both ways. Colonnade Path, I just mentioned, quite open and unplanted. The Cuttings Road also more open than in the previous design. Into the East Cemetery, again, you've seen this one before, more gravel paths with edging, and there's a wonderful, very pretty landscape, obviously with all the spring flowers and ferns, with an avenue of trees planted down the main paths to give some sense of greater structure to the landscape, as we'll see in the overall plan. I think that's quite clear how these more forest trees are used to provide structure up and down the main paths. Although what's interesting is the idea that you shouldn't plant an avenue all of the same variety of tree, because you're leaving yourself vulnerable to the rampages of future diseases. We know enough now about ash dieback, about Dutch elm disease, that you don't want to have an avenue all of the same variety of trees. So mixed avenues, and then inside these sort of woodland compartments, which would include groves of open grassy meadows, graves with wildflowers and other plants we've already seen, mainly natives in the East Cemetery, with the particular species in any one area chosen to suit the ground conditions, which can be quite damp, particularly down the bottom of the slopes down here by Stony Terrace, and also down here at the area we very romantically call Area 10, which sounds like some Soviet suburb, doesn't it? But that's Area 10 in cemetery speak. And then up the top of the hill, the border with Waterloo Park, this is slightly more parky to create a more natural wooded feel as a transition. So next up is Joanna Gibbons from J&L Gibbons.
Highgate Cemetery is just the most extraordinary mosaic of biodiversity and cultural memory. It's a place of personal loss, and it's a great place of contemplation, a place of communication with loved ones. It's an extraordinary place, which is unique, not only in terms of the London environment, but across the world. Our vision for the landscape at Highgate is to do with appreciating this intersection of every aspect of design and stewardship. Our vision is to work with the current assets, which are highly valuable, both natural and built, and to graft in a long-term future for this place. No landscape can be left on its own. It needs to be looked after. And so, if you like, the concept is one of extraordinary respect and radical caretaking. So this question is very complex and incredibly important. It is the essence of life on this planet, all drawn into this one place. So in terms of looking at sustainability is about soil. It's about water management. Water in this place sits right beneath the surface of the cemetery. Springs are rising all over the place, within the cemetery and around it. We want to daylight that water. We want to celebrate it. We want it to be a source of great delight. But we also want to enhance the biodiversity of the place by drawing in light to the ground, by diversifying the flora, by creating that wonderful light and shade that creates opportunities for all sorts of flora and fauna to thrive. So the visitor experience is incredibly important for those that just happen to want to have a wander, and for those who are visiting graves and those who have come from a long way away to immerse themselves in this extraordinary environment. And those ambiguities and those nuances of the past and the future need to be fully played out in the cemetery. It's a rich tapestry of features, but we feel that there's more potential, much more potential, to be able to offer the visitor multiple experiences, historic, aesthetic, and for those who are interested in the science of plants or social histories. Keeping Highgate alive, which might sound like an oxymoron, but it's the absolute essence of it, is fundamental to the character of this landscape. But obviously, it's utterly relevant to all those that come to visit the graves of loved ones. In maintaining the cemetery as a live cemetery, it also allows us, with the friends and the community, to address key aspects of infrastructure. And when we talk about infrastructure, we don't just mean the roads and the pavements and the pathways, we mean the soil. we mean the hydrology, we mean the canopy, the planting, all that critical infrastructure which creates the character of the place. This project represents a lifetime of work. It is quintessentially the kind of project that we absolutely adore, where we're looking back to look forward, where we're immersed in issues of climate change adaptation and resilience in the urban fabric. And some of the work that we have been engaged on and are engaged on at the moment is to do with that. And that includes the Urban Nature Project, which is re-envisaging the whole of the garden for the Natural History Museum, where the whole of geological time is going to be expressed through the garden experience. We're also working at the New Museum of London, which is all about people. It's all about the Londoners, what is important to them, our history over the last 2,000 years. We also are working on the restoration of landscapes at Marble Hill, for instance, and we've just completed Walpole Park in Ealing. So this is a project which we feel very comfortable, but also very, very excited about, and it would be an enormous privilege to be part of this work.
So that's Joanna Gibbons. I love the way she framed herself with greenery as she was recording that video. And here's one of the drawings, which is great. It's raining. And how fantastic is that? Because it highlights the fact that we really do need to think about water. Generally, you've either got too much water or you don't have enough of it nowadays. So they're proposing a site-wide sustainable drainage strategy, including porous paving, but also water channels. You can see this rill coming down the center of this path in the West Cemetery, little, looks like a mini pond there. But also, you wouldn't really know, but there's an area with thinned out trees, and also the borders of the paths reimagined. At the moment, these areas are really highly dominated by intrusive species such as ground elder. The big boards they've submitted are slightly more difficult to interpret. If you look at this as a graphic style for a layman, there's a fair bit of work to do. Work out what is what. There's a key to the sorts of interventions that they'd be proposing within the landscape, but not such an idea of what goes where, as we've seen in the other designs. And I think that's because there's a slight cautiousness, a feeling that you really shouldn't be getting into doing very designed, detailed work until the site is thoroughly understood and comprehensively surveyed. And that also is something that the other competitors have said as well, is that, you know, these are preliminary ideas. We really need to investigate every inch of the site. But I think if you look at some of these phasing drawings, this section of what the tree looks like now here and what it might look like in the future, reduction of the canopy height a little bit, and the increased variety of trees there gives you a reasonable understanding of the sorts of transformations that will happen in the landscape. And then these phased sketches, again, a little bit hard to interpret, but if you follow them through carefully, you'll start to see what's going on. So relatively accidental pattern of trees here with some more structural planting growing up by year 10, and then by year 25, you can see some larger and some smaller trees with a greater variety of open space in the center. So very sensitive response to the site, but you'll need to work a bit harder perhaps to understand exactly what's going on. So I mentioned the report on the website as well. Each of the competitors have submitted about, I think it's about 10 pages of written material describing in much greater detail their thinking about the designs, and also things I haven't talked about this evening a lot. Their response to the climate emergency is one thing. This view, sunlit for change, in the East Cemetery, looking down the main path, you see the path surface here is actually hard, but it is porous, and they have introduced some some green areas in the centre with little, I don't know, they crocuses or snowdrops or something, which you see growing in profusion around the edge, and a slightly informal arrangement of seating. So thinking about the comfort of people there. Interesting, I hadn't spotted that before. There's a guy being filmed for something. I hope that's not a fashion video, because we disapprove of those within the cemetery. But I think that gives you an idea that, you know, this is, again, like the other ones, like Colvin and Moggridge said in their video, this is about evolution, not revolution. And in the East Cemetery, again, you'll see a similar drawing style and similar phasing diagrams. And again, here, this is a really good example of that very similar sort of tree canopy. We have very tall, spindly ash trees in the east, and the proposals to remove some of those. Ash dieback is going to do a lot of it for us anyway, but to substitute a variety of trees with understory layer as well to create a much richer and more interesting landscape. So the final one in the program is a team called Periscope. Here's Daniel Ray.
I think there are a lot of things that make Highgate Cemetery so special, but I would pull out a few themes that are critically important, I think. So the topography and the wilderness aspects, which make it unique among the magnificent 7 cemeteries in London, but also the historical and international significance. You know, it's seen the generations of London. It's been there marking time through all of them. And also, it's internationally significant in terms of its relationship to places like Arlington in the US or Père Lachaise in Paris. We need to think and speak of Highgate in those terms and what it can offer internationally. So it has a local relevance and an international importance. Our approach to Highgate Cemetery has been to try to take a 7-generation look at the life and death cycle of the cemetery. So we're looking forward to our children's children and back to our parents' parents, and trying to understand the impacts of our actions in the past and what we can leave for our children's children. And that, in that way, we trying to address the climate crisis, but also understanding how the culture of burial and death will change in the future and how we can provide for that. It's an interesting challenge to have to try to merge all of these aspirations and understand that we must respect those that are buried there and those that will be buried there and their families. But we do think that there's an opportunity for a radical enhancement of biodiversity on the site, particularly in the East Cemetery. And the approach to both cemeteries must be slightly different because they have different characters and they're from different time periods and they have different constraints. But we can work with the opportunities that climate change affords to transform the cemetery by changing planting techniques, enhancing heritage value and designing for longevity, and try to make sure that local people can reconnect with nature at the cemetery, as well as visitors and members of the public and grave visitors. So we have 2 themes we're going to look at to improve visitor experiences. We've got the technical aspects of improving path surfacing, path routes, and how people can access the cemetery so that we can improve access for all, including wheelchair users, and also looking at aspects such as lighting, where we can put it and how that allows access in the evenings without compromising biodiversity. And then we're looking at access for diverse communities. So we'd like that people that live around the cemeteries to be able to access and be involved in woodland management and perhaps woodland crafts and the activities of managing the cemetery, so that they can have a community ownership over the place and feel that it's part of their green space network where they live. I think this is a critical aspect because we mustn't forget that allowing the families of those who are buried in the cemetery to come and visit is a critical aspect of Highgate Cemetery. In all the aspirations we might have for the cemetery to be used in different ways, its core function is to be a respectful place for people to be buried. We think one of the main ways we can address this is through improving microclimate and routes to graves, so that grave visitors can have a safe and private environment in which to reflect near to all of the graves which they need to be near to. So we have a diverse team. Periscope itself works mainly in London on projects for social and environmental good. We normally work with public authority clients, and we tend to work at large-scale master planning, but also on detailed projects, working physically building projects with communities and trying to upskill local people. So we've tried to couple that with a team that has experience of the kind of projects that Highgate is. So we have the Museum of London, who are helping us work on archaeological aspects. We have the Parks Agency, who have experience working across a number of historic cemeteries in London. And then we have a specialist from who's led on the restoration of Abney Park Cemetery in Hackney, and that's a cemetery which has been left to deteriorate beyond recovery as a working cemetery. And so we're very pleased to have Russell Miller on the team, who's going to help us stop the decay in Highgate and make sure it's managed for future generations.
So that's Periscope, and Periscope has some rather beguiling graphics. This one of the West Cemetery. I think this is coming up towards what's now called the Snowdrop Bank, and this one up the Dickens Path. There's obviously a mature tree just being propped up by this girdle of wooden poles, probably themselves from wood in the cemetery. And then the little thing here, what is this pyramid? Well, they say that they imagine Highgate Cemetery as a place of coexistence for all life and all death, human and non-human. They call it a whole earth cemetery, and their plans are overlaid with layers of meaning. And I'd say understanding it all requires some considerable effort. So it certainly is worth going to look at their panels. But they do talk about that in addition to human graves, there are such things like mausolea for stag beetles. I'd imagine this is a mausoleum for stag beetles, perhaps. They're also proposing contemporary ecological earth practices, which are going to nourish the earth for future generations. And the cemetery would be managed as a circular zero waste woodland. So they're permaculture ideas, those sort of cycles, which in fact everyone's interested in nowadays. No waste as a resource. So those wooden props that you see holding up that tree will be made of old wood from the cemetery, but then also you could write on them or carve into them, I think, your thoughts about the loss of trees and tree species, perhaps. So everything has multiple functions. So their graphic style, again, is requires a little bit of work to work out what all their symbols mean. So I will leave you to investigate a lot of the detail with that yourselves, but you can see that there is quite a lot of change to the landscape of the cemetery, while also opening up historic view corridors like the other competitors have done. But I want to take you to, because this is the fascinating thing, these are the seven. They're interested in numerology. So the Native American, the Iroquois philosophy of 7-generation stewardship that Daniel mentioned, and so they've got the 7 generations here, but they translate into 7 activities: loss, remembrance, reflection, blah 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 blah. So loss, for example, here they talk about the reinstatement of a view corridor. So this is from the Circle looking down to London, with the Hartley Mausoleum there, with quite a hard edge to this, emphasizing that as a contemporary intervention. Remembrance, here these are the mausolea for non-human species. So zoom in and you'll see the Bats Mausoleum there, looking a lot actually like it's inspired by the mausoleum of Julius Beer, and there's another one there, may you rest in peace, and that is a little mammal by the looks of it going on into that one. So that's an interesting and sweet idea. Reflection, the idea that you would retain stumps on site carved into rather fanciful structures, this stump carved into sort of a Gothic filigree, and others that are left as little ponds, little water collections, in the landscape that, of course, would be useful for birds. And the treatment of water, again, something of consideration here, as you see these little retention ponds in the case of heavy rainfall, water routes through the cemetery. Again, all the competitors have been interested in the management of water on site. We mentioned already these tree props, which are inspired by Japanese yukitsuri, I think it's called. But I think the point is there we have to worship the old and treat them as with some honor as great living corpses. And then moving on to longevity, this is the idea of halo thinning. So where you have historic trees, you would clear around them to give them their share of light and air. And those spaces, those cleared spaces beneath, would also provide you with areas on which to sit or to do creative activities such as wood carving or basket weaving or something. And then finally, endurance. They have recognized that there may be a need for some stabilization works in the cemetery to stop subsidence, and they've proposed that these interventions could also have a dual purpose as receptacles for new graves and burials. So you can see there's a very multi-layered approach to the periscope vision of the cemetery. And now you're familiar with that, you can see this view of the East Cemetery with some of those structures. So these ponds made out of the stumps of felled trees, the wood itself left to decay to provide dead wood habitats within the cemetery. They also proposed some new mounds which could be used for new burials and planting. And there we have Karl Marx peering down, not forgotten. But there also is a rather unusual monument here. You can see from the texture that it is made out of carved wood, again carved wood from the cemetery. And I think this is intended to be the monument to the last white rhino, which disappeared, was it back in 2008 or something like that. So human and non-human species get their look in at Highgate Cemetery, as well as some interventions made out of materials from the site. So here, the future forest also has structures built out of trees from the site and a greenhouse chapel that would be constructed and deconstructed by people who would be visiting. So it's a very participatory landscape, and there's a few more of the sites. There's that greenhouse structure I mentioned to you. So there is an awful lot of really interesting detail in the periscope proposals, which I will invite you to consider separately. So for now, I think I should be finishing up, and we've got time for some discussion. I should have said right at the start that I deliberately haven't made up my mind about these wonderful proposals. So if anyone from any of these teams is watching, I have no idea which one I like the best. And if you think I have a favorite at the moment, you're wrong. I've left that deep thinking for next week so as not to betray any prejudices as part of this talk. What I think might be interesting is just have some general thoughts about cemetery landscapes, what they should look like, what sort of things are appropriate to do in them, and what you think might happen at Highgate in the future. But that's the ideas from our landscape team. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was an incredible talk, and what a very effective way of displaying some of the proposals that are under discussion. I particularly like the opening up the historic views, because in the 1960s and 70s, I would take people onto the terrace catacombs in the guided tours for a view over London, and it'd be lovely to see that again. But I know one question that people might ask, seeing so much changes, where does the money come from to do it? Is it there already, or are there grants that you're getting from various places?
Some money is there already, I would say, but as you can imagine, with 36 acres of land to deal with, the sums are absolutely eye-watering, because this has to be done on a grave-by-grave basis. It's not a broad brush sort of approach. And so one of the, I mean, the financial stewardship of the Friends over the particularly the last, 30 years has been absolutely phenomenal. And the very controversial idea of introducing charging to visit the cemetery back in the early 90s, I think it was, has over time given Highgate quite a reserve that we can afford now to be thinking of how to go about looking after the place using, the best and most experienced teams. And that has been a result of as I said before, lots of volunteers, and also not spending the money until we finally sorted out. You'll remember the rather tortuous structure that had 3 charities fighting over the cemetery, which was the source of a lot of upset over the years. Good people on all sides, but the structure, I think, was preventing good things from happening, and so that has been sorted out now. And of course, we'll be looking for lottery funding. Lottery funding is always as much about the benefit to people as to the heritage, and so that is part of a whole new openness and getting people in. And of course, there will be other fundraising activities with trusts, foundations, and private donors. So we'll have the begging bowls out, and of course that will only work if we come up with ideas that are going to get people excited about being let back into this fantastic place and confident that we're looking after it properly for the future.
Thank you. Well, if there are any questions, do unmute yourself and ask.
I see Brenda has had her hand up for a while. Is Brenda, are you there?
Oh,
it was a phantom hand, was it?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely. Sorry.
That's okay. No, easy to do. Catherine.
Hello. Yes. Fantastic and very helpful, Ian. To have given us a bit more detail about the different approaches from the different teams that have been shortlisted. I have 2 questions really. One is, how are you, or whoever frankly is chosen, how are you going to get the message across, which I think some of us are beginning to understand now, that it actually helps biodiversity if you do, in fact, remove some trees and open up spaces and so on. We still have the expression tree hugger, and I think some people are concerned about that. My other interest is how important it is, I think, for us, those of us who live around the cemetery, in terms of how the landscaping on the circumference works in terms of either opening it up or giving privacy. And you did sort of go into some of that detail, which was interesting. Finally, sorry, that people have always wanted to go into the cemetery and see if they can find, funny things or whatever. How are you going to sort of deal with security if you change things round? Sorry, so many questions.
That's okay. It's 3 questions. Hopefully my brain can remember them, because I've got COVID brain like everyone else. But on it, and you think there's something dodgy going on. So the nice thing about Highgate is that there's actually no financial incentive to cut down a tree. Every tree we cut down costs us a hell of a lot of money, and that's because we can't fell it as if it was in a woodland. You get the chainsaw, you let the thing fall over, and that's it. Ours all have to be dismantled, and so we won't be taking down any trees without a massive consideration. The other thing is that I think people are understanding about ash dieback, and the National Trust has had to take down tens of thousands of trees already. It is in the cemetery, and we have some areas which are badly affected already. And those of you who live near Chester Road will have seen the notices up saying we have to remove some of those. And I think that that if you think of the natural accidental things that happen in forests as creating opportunities. So when a tree falls down or when there's a fire or something like that, what that does is create opportunities for successor generations of plants to come up again. And so that the combination of those two things, hopefully, I would say, will reassure any tree huggers. But actually, when you speak to them individually and you look tree by tree at Highgate, you can see that there's really severe problems with our poor trees that have grown up in unplanned locations, often very poorly formed, and many affected by fungus and decay, because they have just been let to grow up by chance rather than a suitable environment being planned for them. So the net result will be probably fewer trees, but a greater variety of trees and more healthy trees. So I think most people like myself who really value the trees in London will see that actually it's about a slightly painful transition from an unmanaged mess in some places to a managed and more sustainable woodland. About the circumference or the perimeter of the site, it's interesting that 1939 photograph I showed you had I think it's probably a privet hedge around most of the West Cemetery, and most of that has disappeared. And I think what you want is a couple of things. You want privacy for grave owners, so they're not subjected to the total scrutiny of passers-by. But you want to be able to see in as you're walking past. It shouldn't feel like Fortress Highgate Cemetery where you can't even look into the landscape. But also, when you're in the cemetery, you need some auditory screening to dampen down the noise of traffic and passers-by to help create a tranquil and peaceful landscape. So that's something I'll expect our designers to come up with, hopefully something that requires a bit less maintenance than a privet hedge, and something we won't need to use petrol-driven equipment to keep control over. The third thing I think was about security, and touch wood. I don't want to don't want to sound as if I'm not worried about it, but the thing is that you get most trouble in a neglected and vandalized landscape. So I've been around long enough to remember, although I can't remember the dates, when you used to walk up Chester Road and there used to be the dangerous structure keep away notices pinned to the railings all along Chester Road and all along Swains Lane as well. And decay, lack of care attracts vandalism like nothing else does. And I remember being so excited when I saw the work that the Friends did to repair the boundary walls, thinking that was for me was the sign that the Friends really knew what they were doing. It's not the most glamorous thing to do, but you remove that aura of decay and you remove the attraction for vandals. I'm sure some people will still get in. It isn't a fortress. I could climb over the railings, although if anyone's listening who's thinking of doing that, please don't, because you could impale yourself in a very nasty way. But I think thankfully we've moved on from that silly, spooky nonsense that we had back in the 1970s and 80s, which was just childish, and is the sort of thing that now we have the internet for. So thankfully, the worst excesses are now catered for virtually rather than dark nights at Highgate. So fingers crossed, we'll see.
Thank you.
Hi, Ian. This was, I don't know if you remember me, Joyce.
Joyce Glasser, I remember your voice. Hello.
But I love your voice. I could listen to it all night. Excellent talk. I have a question. There's so much work that needs to be done. Do they have to close the cemetery to have it done? I mean, that can't be really, can it?
That's a really good question, Joyce. I think the thing is that there's several reasons for doing it over a long period of time. And one is precisely that. We can't close the cemetery. You can't close the cemetery for grave owners. We can't stop people visiting graves. And we also rely on visitor income to keep us going and to generate the funds for the ongoing maintenance of the site. So that's why we're talking 25 years before some of this stuff happens. The other thing, ecologically, what we don't want is a massive disruption in the site. There will be trees going, there will be undergrowth removed, but we want to do that in a controlled way so that we don't impose any stresses on the historic tree stock. So all of a sudden a tree that's been shaded gets full sun and full wind. That's a disaster waiting to happen. And we want to give all the little critters opportunity to move from one part of the cemetery to the other if we're disrupting the habitat that they like. So unfortunately there will be some of those disruptions happening, but there won't be a time when when it feels like the cemetery has been comprehensively cleared. I think it's got to be a really subtle evolutionary process. So I think one of the competitors used a phrase like progressive transformation. So it'll look different every time you come.
Sorry to interrupt. One thing, but I wanted, before someone else asked a question, I wanted to get one thing else in here about this. One of the big problems with these long-term evolutionary things is the people aspect. And we know from government long-term projects, they fail because nobody is in charge, and people die and people move on and people change. And this is a people-centric choice that you're making in a way. So who is going to oversee this? I mean, I'm not going to be alive to see the end of it. I don't know how many people are, but who is going to oversee this over a long period of time?
Well, the one thing is there is an institutional structure to keep that going. So there is a board of 12 trustees, and that's a rotating. So that changes gradually. The trustees have terms of 6 years. There's the professional staff involvement, and you know what? There's also the hideous expense of this work. That means that once we've paid for it, it's going to require a very brave group of people to go, you know what? That stuff they did 5 years ago, we're going to trash all of that. It's such an investment to get these experts involved in the assessments, all the surveys that we've got to do, the ecological surveys, the hydrological ones, the soil conditions, all of this stuff is actually eye-wateringly expensive. And then as if we were to get a Heritage Lottery Fund grant, there's also a period under which you must maintain all of this work, or there's a clawback. So financially, there's a lot of stuff which means that the vision that's settled on is likely to continue. And in fact, many of the proposals see it as an evolutionary process according to fixed principles, recognizing that some things will change. So there's a flexibility built into it by not designing every last square foot right at the start.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else would like to ask a question?
If I may just say something, which is, I think you've partly answered the issue I was going to raise in your in the way you've answered previous questions. What a great talk and fascinating project! How exciting to be involved in something so rich, and I don't know how many, 3-dimensional, maybe 4 if we include the ghosts of people past and all that stuff, or the 5 if we include the future. I just wondered about the thing about so many great projects, so many visions that have were born in with fantastic values, great aesthetic values, great intellectual content, have fallen by the wayside over the years because of the thing of maintenance. So much public good stuff happens and then isn't maintained, and because the cost of maintenance is always horribly underestimated. There's all the money gets generated to build the thing or the things in the first place. One can think of a million lovely estates around Camden. In fact, the one that backs onto the cemetery is an example, where a realistic assessment of how much it's going to cost to run and keep as it is. And I wonder whether that's been factored into some of the presentations you've shown us. I haven't looked at the small print, obviously.
Yeah, so there is a financial plan for those, but the management and maintenance plan that follows is going to be a very important part. So when we're looking at the total cost, we're also looking at what is that going to cost to maintain in the future. So for example, these grand projects that people do and circumstances change, they never repair. I think of France in particular being guilty of those. Say if we were looking at paving in the cemetery, which is which is a preoccupation of mine. You could put in resin bonded gravel paths, which are sustainable, and the water will flow through, so that's all very good, but they will still fail after whatever period of time, whether it's 20, 30, 40 years. And then you have a big capital expenditure to replace those. Or you could go the Victorian route of gravel paths, which require a lot more maintenance year by year, but don't need to be dug up and replaced. And so there may not be that capital work coming up from time to time. So that's a really important part of the planning, to work out what that ongoing maintenance budget will be. But that is an important part of the project as well. Of course, it will make some assumptions. It will make some assumptions that that people will still want to visit cemeteries. But thankfully, that's been the case since the 1840s. Highgate has been a visitor attraction right from its earliest days, and the fascination we have with the memory of those who've gone before us is still here. So I'm reasonably confident about that. Although the last year has shown us you can't be too confident about anything. Who would have predicted we'd have no foreign visitors for a year? It's absolutely incredible. But very good point.
Well, I think, Ian, you've covered so many fascinating points, and I am, together with, I'm sure, many other people, will be looking at that website tomorrow and the cases in detail, and I hope more members do, and comment on them, as we've got the opportunity there. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust will value the comments that you have.
Absolutely.
But anyway, thank you. That's been a riveting evening. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Ian,
It's a
thank
pleasure.
you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.